Hello, Natasha.
Hi, Natasha.
Hi, everyone. Are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. What's the time?
It's dead on 1 o'clock.
Oh, 2
Well,
o'clock down here.
2 o'clock if you're in Melbourne.
It's 2 o'clock, sorry, 1 o'clock Queensland. For all my work colleagues here, sorry.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our International Women's Day talk, Women's History Beyond Stereotypes. I'm Natasha Cantwell, Digital Communications and Public Programming Officer at Public Record Office Victoria, and we're bringing you this talk in conjunction with Her Place, Women's Museum Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the different lands on which we're meeting today. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. If you'd like to ask any questions during the talk, people have already started, but please use the chat function. So we're going to have questions at the end, but you put your questions in throughout the talk and we'll answer them at the end of the talk. So our host this afternoon is Penelope Lee, who is a museum professional, cultural producer, arts manager and artist who has worked across Melbourne's cultural sector for over 25 years with a focus on community engaged, interdisciplinary and inclusive arts, education and cultural programming. She's currently a board director and previously the general manager at Her Place, Women's Museum Australia. Penelope has co-curated the exhibition Unmasked, Celebrating Nursing and Midwifery, Victoria and Beyond, along with our speakers Madonna and Odette, and like them is a qualified general and mental health nurse. Unmasked is currently showing at Her Place Museum, and it features lots of records from different collections, including Public Record Office Victoria. So I'll now hand over to Penelope.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and welcome everybody and thank you for tuning in. As you know, this talk coincides with International Women's Day, Choose to Challenge. And the name of the talk today is called Women's Histories Beyond Stereotypes. And this focus is definitely going to be looking at nurses and midwives. And it's acknowledging the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife in 2020. And the talk today does form part of a broader project, which Natasha mentioned, Unmasked, Celebrating Nursing and Midwifery in Victoria and Beyond. And this is an exhibition which has been a collaboration. It's been funded by Safer Care Victoria and significantly supported by the ANMF. And it's currently on display at Her Place, and we'll give you some details at the end. But our two guests today will discuss this surprising breadth and depth of this complex and fascinating history of women's work and history. And it will become really clear over the course of the next hour how the title fits with this year's International Women's Day theme, Dare to Challenge, as they will leave assumptions aside and unpack how new interpretations can challenge stereotypical narratives of history. So the format will be myself offering question prompts to both Madonna and Odette, and that will be over about the next 40 minutes. And then we're going to tune into your questions, and we invite you to send them through via the chat. So before we go any further, I would like to introduce our two guests. So the first I'd like to introduce is Dr. Odette Best. Odette is a woman of the Wakun clan of the Goran, Bunthamara and Yogamare Nation. She's a professor in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Southern Queensland. After training as a general nurse at Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane, Odette undertook clinical practice, then policy work, and later moved into academia. One of Odette's main research area is Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who completed recognised training in nursing and or midwifery before 1950. We also have Dr. Madonna Grehan. And Madonna is an independent historian who also worked as a general and nurse and a midwife before moving into women's health research. She completed her PhD in nursing and midwifery history at the University of Melbourne. Madonna is an interviewer for the National Library of Australia's Oral History and Folklore Collection and an immediate past president of the Australian and New Zealand Society of the History of Medicine. So thank you both for being here, coming from different time zones, and we're really thrilled to have you participate and bring to visibility and more public nature the topic that we want to look at today. So I just wanted to start with the first question to Madonna, if I may. What's the background to the title of today's discussion, Women's History Beyond Stereotypes? Tell us how you came to that.
One of the things about the way we look at history, generally speaking, is that we have a kind of communal understanding of what our history is. And, you know, popular culture has a big role in how we understand all sorts of history. Then we have really dominant characters. We have dominant experiences. We have war, which people focus on because, you know, war is different from everyday practice, everyday life, everyday experience. So it's not surprising that a lot of history tends to focus on kind of milestones or events. But actually, ordinary history that happens every day of the week, yesterday, the day before, the day last week, who knows what we were doing the week before, it's historic, but it's mundane and ordinary. So in some ways, it's really, people think it's not worth recording or remembering or knowing about. And yet, to me, some of the most important things about, particularly in the nursing and midwifery professions, which help us understand what we are today and how we got here, are avoiding the stereotypes. I mean, if you ask any person in the street, or even sometimes a young nurse, a student nurse even, you know, name a famous nurse, they'll say Florence Nightingale. If they're pushed, they might say Elizabeth Kenny, who was did the polio therapy. But, you know, those two people, I kind of liken them, I'm ashamed to say Donald Trump, they're shameless self-promoters. And the reason that we have such a profile about them is of them, and an understanding of them and a recollection of them as representing what our professions are about, is that they were very, very effective communicators. Nightingale wrote, you know, treatises and letters constantly to nursing and medical journals, newspapers, etc., etc. And Kenny was very good at promoting her image, particularly with hats. She was well known for her hats, so she got photographed a lot. And of course, you know, along with that goes Sister Kenny, famous nurse. So if you leave them aside, there are thousands and probably millions of other people, women, men, nurses, midwives, working in very ordinary practice, but no less contributing to a very rich and diverse history. And in many, many ways for my work, it's that really ordinary, mundane history that's actually much more meaningful and more interesting and more relatable to local communities, to particular hospitals, now to universities and so on. So I like to think that we can, in this year's idea of choosing to challenge, ironically, the International Women's Day, thinking beyond the stereotypes actually gives us a new history, something else to think about. Oh, didn't know that. And in the exhibition that we're doing, we can talk about this a little bit later, we've got people who nobody will have heard of, but they're actually no less important and certainly no less interesting than the ones who are up in lights all the time. So I think it's time now to look a bit sideways, laterally, and think about the broader history of what nursing and midwifery is about, all the policy stuff, the research stuff, sure, the war stuff, there's a heck of a lot that's got a bit that is has room to be uncovered.
Thank you, Madonna. I think those more marginalised histories are really of great interest, and I know there's been a lot of curiosity so far in the exhibition about that. So Odette, equally with yourself, in your field of nursing and midwifery history, what role have stereotypes played in that?
For me, I think there's many stereotypes towards Indigenous people and both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and women, full stop. So I think there's a lot of stereotyping at play, and there has been historically ever since, you know, invasion and subsequent colonisation. When I was undertaking my PhD, and I completed that about 10, 11 years ago now, I decided to interview 6 decades of specifically Aboriginal women, and in Queensland, I didn't feel like I had the skill to actually address a Torres Strait Islander women. And I wanted to really look at some of the contributions that Aboriginal women had actually made to Aboriginal health. And I think because having been a nurse for so long now, for me, there's this great and grand assumption that Aboriginal people are recipients of healthcare, and that in actual fact that we're not active providers of healthcare. And we are active providers of healthcare, and we've been active providers of healthcare for an incredibly long time. And so there was a whole deficit discourse for me around how Indigenous health was actually represented. And at the time, I was teaching in universities, USQ and QUT and University of Queensland. And I would often be told by non-Indigenous nurses, peoples, and everybody from, the academy, oh, there aren't many Aboriginal nurses, are there? And I would always say, well, there's never been any robust research into that to find out. And in my own training at the Princess Alexandra Hospital, I was identified on my first day as Aboriginal, clearly. I look Aboriginal. And one of my educators said to me, oh, we don't have many of your kind that come through here. So I was identified as an other immediately. And she said, I wonder if you're the first. And I was scared stupid, being my very first day of my training and wanting to sit there and be a good girl and listen and, be upright. And I actually thought in my head, no, you're wrong. My cousin had come through the Princess Alexandra Hospital 10 years prior to me. But I certainly was not in a position to say that to a sister or to challenge a sister overtly that actually you're wrong. So for me, it was kind of like there's a whole dominant discourse around not only how Aboriginal people are positioned in the realm of Aboriginal health of being the recipients of care and that we're actually passive. And there's no discourse around, actually, no. We need to redress discourse, disrupt dominant discourse around Aboriginal women in particular have been providers of care with qualification for 120 years in Australia. And it's very unknown history, not well researched history, and it's become my absolute passion to start redressing some of that discourse and deficit around Aboriginal people.
The other thing that I'd say about Odette's work, if I may, Odette, is that it's a real cause for celebration. There are people who've really fought against the women who've, in this case, we've got some slides to show you a little bit into the conversation, which we can come to. Odette's got some examples and I have too, because they're women who really, really, despite every odds that was placed in their path, every obstacle, they managed to find a way to gain education, and education that was recognised. So, it's a celebratory story instead of a kind of bad story, because
absolutely
all of the stories are complex with Aboriginal history and colonisation. So it's a really lovely change to have something to celebrate.
Absolutely. We are not the deficit. We are often stereotyped to be.
But actually, Odette, when you're talking about, let me ask if I may, when you say I wasn't ready to do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, how does that work for you as an Aboriginal woman doing that kind of work?
Oh, okay.
TI.
Up on the Torres Straits. Well, a lot of the rest of Australia don't actually know where the Torres Straits are. And, they were annexed onto Queensland. So Queensland, it's very familiar language to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So for me, we have a Torres Strait Islander nurse. There's two. One of them is featured in the museum. And I have interviewed her in depth and quite a lot for the National Library of Australia. I, like Madonna, do interviewing and for the Oral Histories projects, specifically around hospital-trained Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses. And the difference for me, I think what you're alluding to, Madonna, is that our community protocol or Indigenous protocol around accessing community first, seeking family members and seeking permission around information, their stories, their qualifications, photography, the whole notion of primary and secondary source gathering, but I go to their families first and foremost. So for me, not being a Torres Strait Islander nurse, but having worked and still hang with and have friends up in the Torres Strait Islander, I actually had a good inroad because I actually nursed up in the Torres Strait Islands up in the 90s on a small community called York Island. It's called the Teardrop Island, and it is beautiful. So for me, I had a segue for me to actually ring up some of the Torres Strait Islander nurses that I had worked with and said, hey, you know what? I'd like to do some work around blah, blah, blah. Who do I contact? What is their family? Can you give me protocol to actually engage? So that's how I actually engage with that Torres. And in saying that, it's still something that I don't largely do around the Torres. However, for this exhibition, I specifically asked for us to include a Torres Strait Islander nurse, Annie Dulcie Flower, whose history is talk about celebratory and remarkable. And she's very cheeky and she's outrageous. And she was a nurse and midwife, and she used to call Fred Hollows that young doctor, that young man. Now, not a lot of Australians could have actually gotten away with that, but Annie Dulcie Flower certainly could. So I personally would like to see a Torres Strait Islander historian actually pick up that work. It hasn't happened to date, and I will do it when I'm asked to do it or when I'm invited to. And Annie Dulcie did invite me to actually record her story.
Thanks.
It sounds like, sorry, it's an absolute sort of area of research that's very much in progress and evolving all the time.
Oh, yes.
I suppose it's a natural time to ask the question. I mean, you both started out as nurses and or midwives. What was the catalyst to get you both into the field of being historians on nursing? I feel like you touched on it, Odette, but was there a moment in time for both of you that you thought, I want to know more about this, I want to understand it more deeply?
I'll back to Madonna first.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I had a really long-standing interest in family history, and I wrote to a family magazine called Parade. It was a bit like it was a sort of a general women's weekly. It had a general readership, but it was a bit more. I don't know how you describe it really. It was not a Reader's Digest. It was a magazine that had interesting articles in it, and it had a family history page. And when I was 13, because my dad used to talk about family history all the time, I wrote to a family historian in Tasmania who sent me screeds and screeds and screeds of information about our Irish background.
Yeah.
And so I became interested early on, and I'd had a long-standing interest in family history. And I went back to uni when I was about 29 and started history again. And then later on, I did a PhD in history. I was approached to do that actually. And it turned out to be I would never have dreamt it up myself, the project, because it was a history of nursing and midwifery regulation in the care of women. And it was about the time that a new degree course in midwifery alone was introduced in Australia. And it's turned out to be a really fascinating career change for me, and a really lovely one, because it's returned to what I was particularly interested in. But I think when you, like any discipline, when you are part of the discipline that you're studying, it does give you different insights. Just like I would never do engineering history because I still don't understand trucks and cars and trains, but I do understand healthcare, and it's a different overlay from maybe studying another field, but it still holds my interest. And as Odette has demonstrated, there are reams of untold stories about interesting and important people in our history. So it's an occupation for life, I think.
I think for me, I mean, like after I finished my training, I didn't want to work in a hospital. I struggled in my nurse's training, I'll be really honest. I just thought they smelt bad. And so after I finished my nurse's training from Princess Alexandra Hospital, I wanted to go into community health. So I did go barreling down the road into community health, and I worked at Bogger Road Women's Prison and also the Aboriginal Medical Service in Brisbane. And I was really lucky because there were no senior Aboriginal nurses at the PA hospital in my training. And my cousin had moved on after she finished her training. And so it was the first time for me that I'd come across professionally working with these older Aboriginal nurses who trained in, at that stage, the 70s and the late 60s. And they were first cousins, and they're from Stradbroke Island, which is where my father's mob come from. That's the Yugambeh connection for me. And so we would sit around and talk and yarn, what was your training like? And, you know, they used to say to me, oh, but Odette, you were the last ones out the door. You didn't have it as tough as what we did back in the 60s and the 70s. And, you know, I just sit there going, well, no, because they tell me their stories and I go, they used to make you do what? So I was a really different generation to what those 60s and those 70s girls that did train before me, because I was the 80s. And there were sometimes those questions of, oh, and so trained in the 50s. And as I became more of an older Aboriginal registered nurse, there was this kind of like dominant discourse that was occurring that the first Aboriginal nurses trained in the 50s. And me having a really inquiring mind, and what happened to me on my first day of my training, I actually really had that question in my head, well, how do you know that? How do you actually know that? And like there was a couple of nurses in particular that got trained in the 50s in New South Wales, and they were often touted as, oh, she was the first Aboriginal nurse out of New South Wales. And my head was like, yeah, how do you know that?
Pioneers.
Yeah, how do you know that? So for me, undertaking my PhD, I'll be honest, I actually did start at the 1950s because it was a nurse that was still alive, who I knew trained in the 1950s, and I did every decade after that. So I started in the 50s and did 6 decades. But it was whilst I was doing my PhD, I actually came across 2 nurses that I was just like, oh, wow, there you go. That just absolutely blew that theory out of the water. One got trained in the 1940s. She's also included on one of the slides that we've got here today. And then there was a midwife-only Aboriginal woman who trained as a midwife in 1905. So for me, it was then like, well, there actually goes that theory that nurses started training in the 1950s. I personally think it was probably, well, not probably, but was attached to the Assimilation Acts. And in the 50s, when Assimilation Acts came into play as an act of administration of Aboriginal people, they tried to assimilate them into professions, such as nursing for girls, because that just seemed a natural segue for them. But under that protectionist and segregationist acts from the 1890s to the 1940s, that's the really unknown territory. And I know that there's a bucket load of Aboriginal women that trained in that era. So I think it was just my inquiring mind, and that educator to me on the first day going, oh, you're the only one. It was like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Motivator.
And Odette has just received an ARC grant to do work in Queensland to look at more nurses who had trained before the 1950s. So it's the long haul to get funding to do these things. But I mean, it just goes to show, even with the within the Aboriginal community, they had one understanding of their own history that now someone within their community can say, well, actually, it's broader than that. And on this.
And it's one of those professions that has really struck me over the last 30 years, being entrenched in the Aboriginal community in Brisbane, because that's where I was reared, and also, you know, on Stradbroke Island and my family connection up to Woorabinda Mission in central Queensland. Everyone I talk to always says, oh, my auntie was a nurse. Oh, my grandmother was a nurse. So it's one of those really, what I would almost say, common professions for Aboriginal women that just no one has done a lot of work around. There was people who did, like Madonna did some work on Sadie Canning out of Western Australia. There has been a few bits and bobs, but again, it's usually post-assimilation. You know, it's not pre-1950s. So I think I'm just a bit of a nosy busybody, inquiring mind of wanting to prove people wrong, to be honest.
Perfect historian, I'd say. Are you able to tell us a bit more about, just briefly, obviously, about your ARC? And I can only imagine the way you source history must be slightly different from what perhaps had Madonna source history in terms of those primary resources. Can you tell us both briefly about how you go about your history making and taking?
You
Odette,
touched on Madonna.
do you want your slides? Do you want me to put on?
Yeah, look, that would be great. If they're a good prompt at this point.
It might. I'm just going to share my screen. So
Madonna, you share your slides first around your work and around how you actually access your
okay.
primary, and then I'll follow.
Is that okay with you, Penelope? We're being very democratic here. And just sing out if this doesn't work.
Yep.
You can all see that. So what I wanted to start with, because Odette and I, because of her Aboriginal background, she has a particular approach. And I'm using, I use family history too, because of course, that's where you get, oh yes, my aunt worked with Florence Nightingale or something like that. And I've learnt that there's always a grain of truth to these stories. So you must be careful not to dismiss them, because I used to dismiss them, and I learnt the hard way that was a dumb idea. But one of the things, three women here who worked in Australia in the 19th century, I heard about through family history connections, or actually the one on the right, Mary Howlett, I heard about through an archive, particular archive, and then I've gone off into communities and investigated her. But, you know, for example, people have a stereotypical understanding that Australia is built on convicts and that all of our early nurses were convicts. Now, that's just not true, because there are women with recognised qualification from England, Scotland, Ireland and Europe who came here very, very early on. I'll show you an example of a certificate in a minute. These two women on the left were not, didn't have formal recognition. Eliza Nelson was a woman who had 5 children and walked with her newborn baby to Creswick, to the goldfields in the mid-1850s, and then took up midwifery around Daylesford. She actually invented a cream. She's featured in our exhibition because she actually patented her soothing cream. So some of these women are intelligent and they're entrepreneurial, and yet they get dismissed very regularly because the modern histories of nursing needed to promote nursing as a profession as something better than went before. So these women are denigrated, and they're described as alike or likened to Sarah Gamp, who was featured in The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, which was a serialised novel that Charles Dickens put out in 1843. And actually, nurses and midwives of the colonial type are referred to as Sarah Gamp in the Victorian Parliament right up until the 1950s, because everybody had a kind of classical education and read Dickens. So it's amazing how these stereotypes can stick. But the woman on the right in this slide, for example, is Mary Howlett. She was a woman who undertook midwifery nurse training at the Women's, which was offered from 1859. And her certificate survived. It's a bit rat-eaten, but it's in a particular collection in Victoria. And this is an example. We have this in the exhibition. It's a highly unusual thing to have in Australia because it's dated 1779, and Australia wasn't very old by that stage in white colonisation, Odette, terms. Because see, we still don't think that everybody's a convict and comes with no education, but this is the certificates that women were, or it's a diploma actually. It's called a diploma. It's certified. And this was awarded by the Professor of Midwifery, Thomas Young, from the University of Edinburgh, because it was medical men and women could obtain 12 weeks of education and then be engaged for unpaid in a lying-in hospital, which was a charitable institution. So, you know, the assumption is that people came to Australia without any education is not true in terms of the white population. So we do have this on display in Melbourne. We also imagine that people, we've got a particular idea that a nurse is a nurse and a midwife is a midwife, and they're not the same thing. I mean, that's a complicated story in history terms, and it's not a trajectory that's like a straight arrow. There's a great Canadian historian and linguist called Hans Kellner, and he wrote a book in the 1980s, I think, maybe even the 1990s, called Getting the Story Crooked, because history is never a straight road. It's always got bends and turns, and, you know, you want to have your history warts and all, because someone else who I can't remember said, if you cut off some of your history, you're an amputee. And that's quite true. You know, some people, well, you know, midwifery history in some cases is about abortion, infanticide, not that often, but medical history is about that too. Medical history is about bad practice sometimes, same with nursing and midwifery practice. But I think you have to embrace it all to understand it, to get a better understanding of what we have today and why we practice the way we do. This is a really good example, something else from our exhibition. And these are blown up. They're actually bigger than the items that are in the little case in the top of the slide. This woman did a midwifery training pathway only in, and I mean only in that she wasn't a general nurse. This pathway was still offered at the women's, and she was a community, midwifery nurse in Hawthorne. She always worked with the doctor, but she's packed up her case one day in 1926 and left it, and her family have given it to the women's. But, you know, some of these women, according to medical practice in the 20s, they had such bad reputations. But if you look at this case and undo it, look at the safety pins, the strychnine, which you used for high blood pressure, the enema, which was used for douching. She has everything that was required by law in her case, in her midwifery case. And undoing it can help you understand exactly how she followed what was required of her as a registered midwifery nurse. And there's a couple of other examples here. We hear a lot about war nurses, and often World War I and World War II. And actually one of the women who went to the Second Anglo-Boer War with this woman, Mary Ann Rawson, who was one of the first 3 Australian nurses to be awarded a Royal Red Cross. One of her nurses married in Africa, in South Africa, and stayed there, but came back after her husband died. And she turned up at the Returned Nurses Club in about 1920. Now, the Returned Nurses Club was for World War I nurses. And this particular nurse had she'd been given her war medals from the Boer War by the King, and they wouldn't let her join, and they wouldn't let her come to any meetings. So within that stereotypical history of, you know, everything about military nursing starts with World War I, we have already forgotten about the Boer War nurses and the incredible contribution they made. Now, there was no reserve in Victoria, no Army Nursing Service reserve when Mary Ann Rawson took her 10. There was a dispute about who was to pay for them. So they had to be employed by England in theory, which is why we really have forgotten about them. And on the right-hand side, there's a body chart with numbers on one side and letters on the other. And Lucy Garlick was a Melbourne nurse who went up to the Kimberley to work. And on the old $20 note, the first polymer $20 note, this body chart is right in the middle. We have a copy in our exhibition because Lucy devised this for use with the pedal radio. And she came up with a set of questions. A note on the bottom of this, I don't know if you can see my mouse there, she says, "Thank you," at the bottom of her questions. So instead of not knowing or imagining where someone was reporting a problem from, she came up with this system. Lovely, a nurse with a system. And if the person doesn't know what part of the body it is, all you had to do was say, oh, 1A was hurting, and she could, the operator, the doctor or the nurse could say, well, yeah, it might be a ruptured liver. We'd probably get a plane out there. And this is in the mid-1950s before telephones were available. And the funny thing about this poor nurse and why she's been forgotten, she sent all this off to the health department, but she was working in the Kimberley, nowhere near a post office. And she gave it to a doctor who posted it in Wyndham. And guess whose name got on the book? It wasn't Lucy Garlick's. But she wrote all over her copy saying, Dr. Edwards had nothing to do with the writing of this book. I did it myself, and it's a world copyright. So there's another person who had an innovative program and managed to get swamped with her invention. So let me just move on to Odette's slide and hand over to Odette.
Thanks so much, Madonna. Odette, you're on mute.
Sorry, I knew that would have to happen. Can you go back 2 slides? That's the 3rd slide.
Oh, I've got them back.
Yeah, so that's the 1st slide. Thank you. My work initially post PhD was very much around the Native Nurses Training Scheme that occurred here in Queensland. As far as I can find at the moment, it's the only state right across Australia where we have this thing called a Native Nurses Training Scheme. And it's actually relatable to the acts of administration over Indigenous people. So right across Australia, but certainly within Queensland, in 1897, we had the very first Protectionist and Segregation Act within Australia of Aboriginal people. So that was driving them into missions and reserves. It was actually the template for South African apartheid. So when we had our missions and reserves set up in Queensland, we had a number of them right across the state. And this is Woorabinda back in the 1940s. And this is the mission that my mother's side of the family were all actually removed to. So you can see clearly the matron in the middle. And what was so special about this photo was the 2 women standing beside her. You may be able to notice if you look closely that they're actually a set of Aboriginal twins, and they were Native nurses. But also, as you can see, there's 2 little twin babies that had been born at the hospital as well. So that's just one of my favourite photos. That's all. That's why I like that one so much of Woorabinda. Flick on to the next one though, Madonna.
The Native Training Scheme.
Yeah, the Native Nurses.
Odette, can you say something about your granny?
Yeah, of course. That's what I'm going to do. Yeah. So with doing this, and it's answering your question, Penelope, when you talk or ask the question about how we actually access materials and primary sources and what we do. And with this particular research, because it was under the Protectionist and Segregationist Acts within Queensland, a lot of those missions and reserves, their records have been locked down. And so there's like, some of them have been locked down for 99 years, 55 years. There was no consistency. However, we know that the longer the lockdown of the material in our archives is usually an indication of just how bad a place actually was, because they do not want any living person to be able to challenge the treatment that actually was imposed upon them. So when I went into the archives here in Queensland, because it was my grandmother, we call her Mukan, that is our language for old woman or old tongue. So I was asking my Mukan about Woorabinda back in the days when she was a young woman. And she did say to me, oh, they had that nurses thing at that hospital. And that's all she said. She wags a finger. She said they had that nurses thing at that hospital. I was like, oh, okay, Mukan, what does that mean? And they said, oh, they only did it for us black girls. And it was like, oh, okay. So I started to try and dive into the archives about that to try to gather some information. And I did ask my grandmother whether I could have permission to actually seek out records around the Native Nurses Training Scheme. And the reason I sought out my grandmother or my Mukan is because she's well over 100. She's got 3 recorded birth dates. The youngest birth date puts her at about 102. And that was the one written up in the back of a cattle book. And then she's written down in some station owner's Bible, and that would put her at about 105. And she refuses to acknowledge how old she is, but we do know that she's well over 100. And she's the only survivor of the initial Woorabinda mission being commenced as a mission. And so what I basically did was I went down to the archives and said, oh, I'd like some information on the Native Nurses Training Scheme, specifically looking at Woorabinda. It would have been created in the 1940s. And I was told that all the information was locked down and that I couldn't access it. And I was just like, what do you mean? And they were like, you cannot access any information on this native nurses training scheme out of Warrabinda unless you can actually get, and this is where it was a bit cheeky of them and loaded, unless you can actually get a letter and signature from somebody who was there when it got locked down. Well, of course, that's my grandmother. And I looked at the woman and I said, oh, so would a letter from my grandmother do? And she just like looked at me, was like, what? You know, I'm a grey-haired 50-year-old woman, you know, so it was just like, really? It was like, oh yeah, my grandmother's still alive and she's kind of like in her hundreds. So I'll get a letter from Nana. And I must admit, I was being a bit cheeky and a bit bolshy too. So I wrote the letter, went back up to Rocky. Mukam, they won't let me access the records. They won't let me pull records on you. They won't let me pull the records on Pa, her husband, my grandfather. They won't let me pull the records. And she was like, where's the letter? So, you know, Mukan actually signed the letter, did all that type of stuff, and they all had numbers. So she wrote the number down that she was known as in Warrabinda and the year and all that, took that down. So they let me then access these sources of information from the archives. So dealing with Indigenous histories and archival retrieval can be extraordinarily tricky. And that's why for me, it's about accessing the families first, the communities where they come from, seeking permission from them, kind of like having your ducks kind of like in a row, because it can be very problematic diving and doing a deep dive into archives to try and pull information. Of course, we've got gazettes because all nurses in Queensland were actually gazetted. I was even gazetted in the late 80s. But you've got to make sure you have your ducks in a row. So this is one of the native nurses training schemes that ran on 3 of our missions in Queensland, on Palm Island, Warrabinda and Cherbourg. It commenced on Warrabinda, so the mission that my mother's mob are all from, this is where it actually commenced. And it was a 2-year training program that was delivered by the matron, some of the sisters and the visiting medical officers at the time. They were actually given hospital exams that were utilised in all training hospitals right across Queensland. However, it was a 2-year program. At the end of it, they were only given what was called a certificate of attainment, and they were not recognised as nurses. They were not allowed to be gazetted as nurses. They were not allowed to go and work in any hospital, and they were only allowed to be transferred to the other missions that had the native nurses training scheme. So doing deep archival dives at this particular, you know, like women's forced labour history for Aboriginal women can be a real minefield, especially because of some of that, can you get a letter? And I kind of like don't think they expected to say, oh, I'll just ring up Nana and get it. Will that do? So I did. And that particular note there that I've got on the screen now, that actually came out from the visiting medical officer, who was actually blown away at how high the results of the nurses were, and clearly saying that it followed the curriculum of what was called the great teaching hospitals in Queensland.
Yeah, but the point is that the women themselves, it just goes to show they're intelligent and
Absolutely.
they do the work well.
Absolutely.
So it's a good story in some ways, but in other ways it's still demonstrating the ethnic divide.
Oh, absolutely.
Between what was available to those people.
Policies of administration, the policy era.
So
And this photo, here's the lovely Doreen Booson, and she was technically the very first native nurse that went into the native nurses training scheme at Warrabinda in 1942. So that's her actually standing at the bottom of the hospital stairs. Yeah.
Penelope, did you have your hand up?
I did, thank you. And thank you for all the commentary. I just wanted to, there's a question that's come through, Odette, regarding if we go back to that other slide, regarding the doctor, the back row. I think it might have been the most recent one. Madonna, yes. A person is interested to see, I'm sorry, it's a little bit off the screen. Matt back row, is he the doctor superintendent? And she's quite interested in his position in relation to the nurses.
Oh, right. Up in the back. No, superintendents were white people. They were never Indigenous people. So I think you're actually talking about the front photo that I showed with the twins.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. Indigenous people were not superintendents of the missions. They were always white people.
He'd be a wardsman or something, Odette,
He
wouldn't
would be, yes, he would be a wardsman.
Okay.
And what Mukan did tell me when I actually did get this photo, because I did ask my grandmother if she could name them, and she could name the young woman who'd had the baby. And I said, Nana, who are these? And she was like, them native girls who did nursing, and did say that he used to have that old fella out the back helped around the hospital. So we would call him a wardie. Yeah.
Okay.
I know Aboriginal people were certainly not superintendents.
No. So thank you for that question, Sue. Are there more? Yes, please.
Only the last one is just a really quick one. The first one that I can find who trained in Queensland at this stage was this particular woman here, the lovely Muriel Stanley. But unfortunately, she trained in the 40s, and she trained in Sydney at South Sydney Women's Hospital, obstetrics only. So she was a midwife only. And no hospital in Queensland would accept her because she was too black. And so she was part of the church, the Anglican church. And so she essentially was really well supported to be able to go down to South Sydney Women's Hospital to undertake her training. As soon as she finished, they exempted her from the active administration. So she was allowed to travel back up to Yarrabah Mission, where she actually was the matron for a number of years. And I just love these photos of Muriel. So that's all from me.
Fantastic. Okay, another question. It is from a Jan Jones to the panelists. Louise Pepper Connolly was a Brat Taulalong woman who was recognised as a nurse and a midwife in East Gippsland Aboriginal community. A plaque in her honour is located at Bairnsdale, gives the dates from 1840 to 1920. And I know that we had a discussion the other day about, I suppose, the work that needs to be done in Victoria about having a deeper understanding of Australian Aboriginal nurses in this state. Have you heard of this particular person? Either of you? Or?
No, well, Odette's, the work that Odette's been, if you don't mind, Odette, the work we've been looking at, I've done a little bit of work with Odette before, and it was about pinpointing women who had access to recognised training, so the training that their white counterparts could do. And that's a very complex exercise. In Queensland, they had to leave missions and reserves, and they had to apply, and they were not allowed back.
Yep.
So it was a big step for people to take on a career, but Odette's work goes to show that it was possible. There's a whole other story of other women who weren't part of that training program in any form, who served their communities, whether white or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. There's a whole untold story of the women who did that community service. And it's lovely to know that there's a plaque in Bairnsdale. I haven't heard of that, but Jan, I'm sure you'll be able to find Odette, and we'll both be able to take inquiries from people if we don't get to your questions today.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I've got another question here too, if you're happy for me to read it. It's a little bit longer. And I'm mindful of the time. We've got about another 5 minutes. This is my great-grandmother was the first midwife in Sunshine between 1915 and 1925 and worked with the first medical officer, Dr. John Adamson. I'm not sure if she did have any formal training, or indeed it was required at the time. She had 9 children of her own, and is taking on this work. Interestingly, she also prepared bodies for burial. So she had to hatch and dispatch. Do you know if she had to do formal training, or if the doctor would have trained her?
I can answer that one.
Not touching that one, Madonna.
The midwifery, a Midwives Act was introduced in 1915 in Victoria. It didn't prevent people from practicing as a midwife without training. In fact, there was a grandfathering clause if you could give a reference from a priest or a doctor to say that you'd been in bona fide practice. So some women, when you say the first midwife, it's always, I'd use that word with caution because it's probably the first one that's either been written down or we know about, and there's usually others around the area practicing. It's just that we don't know about them. Either they're not infamous or they're not, they didn't do anything bad, so we don't know anything about them. But training was available in Victoria from 1859. Mrs. Howlett, who was on that slide earlier, they had pupil nurse training in midwifery and the care of women, which included gynecological training, and then got split in the 1880s. And then general training became available also in the mid-1880s as the bigger hospitals expanded, the charitable hospitals like the Melbourne and the Alfred, Bendigo, Heathcote, those rural ones. So it's possible to know if she was registered in Victoria and if she had training, because there's a category in the register that explains it. So if you want to contact me, I'll be able to tell you probably.
Thank you. There's a few more minutes if anyone else has any further questions to send through to either Madonna or Odette. But I suppose I was really curious, in particular Madonna. I mean, the challenge of producing an exhibition and curating at a time over the last 12 months has obviously been highly challenging as a historian, because, you know, for those of us in Melbourne, we're in lockdown for most of the year.
And we had for those of you who weren't there at the beginning of the discussion, we had the launch of our exhibition at her place last night. And it was such a relief because Victoria really was locked down such a long time. And what that meant for curatorial work or any sort of research work was that all the libraries and collections were closed. So Penelope and I and Odette from Queensland, we've curated this exhibition without having access to public collections. And which I'm really pleased about in a way, because it meant we had to think hard about what we could use, how we could tell a story and that's meaningful, that actually does challenge the stereotypes but still tells a really valuable story. And it helps to know people with collections in garages, because it's amazing what people have at home. So the ribbon that went around that collection of the flowers that went from the Women's Hospital Committee to Mary Ann Rawson and her nurses from the Second Anglo-Boer War, that's been saved by her and handed down, and a very helpful family member donated it to the collection, donated it for the period of the exhibition. And I was saying to a florist this morning, you'll see my International Women's Day floral arrangement behind me, everything about floral history is disposable. There's very little of it other than design pictures that are kept. So it's quite a unique item in itself. But even getting access to uniforms, we have a uniform of a nurse who was in charge of the Melbourne Hospital Emergency Department, Margaret Nuttall, and her great aunt was a nurse, and her aunt was a nurse, and she's a nurse, and her niece is a nurse. And so there's some, and Florence Green's midwifery case, that's come from a family at Druin Women's Hospital. So it's actually provided, it's been difficult, but it's provided an opportunity to think differently about what we think of as our history and to tell new stories.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been a really interesting challenge, and it's been wonderful to work with you both. But it's a very comprehensive snapshot of a very broad history, a very complex history. But there's a real intimacy, because you just drill down and you look at these beautiful objects of emotion that just trigger this sense of history and placement, and they're juxtapositioned against the contemporary people that are featured in the exhibition. And I'm mindful that people are asking more about the exhibition, and it can be seen at Her Place Women's Museum. That's a newly established women's museum based here in Victoria, in East Melbourne. And we do feature 12 women in all. And they're aligned with 6 key themes that have been sort of massaged as sort of the cornerstones of what we wanted to cover in the exhibition. But the 6 contemporary nurses are all practitioners. We have a male nurse in the mix. Obviously, they are involved in the history of nursing too. But they too, it was a really interesting challenge for them to provide objects and artefacts of their practice, because literally, because they're living and breathing it, again, they don't see their particular things as of any relevance. But of course, it took us to say, no, that tells a story. Please include that. So if you come along, you can hear their stories via an audio-visual interview, where people who are of a more historical nature are able to see through images. We've got lots of fantastic photos too that has been provided, you know, through Madonna and Odette's research. So I implore you all to come along. Go onto the website. You can see it along the bottom, and it will tell you the days. We're open from Tuesday to Saturday. And we really welcome you to come along. And obviously, I think this talk in itself is probably going to generate a lot of interest by the public, and, you know, knowledge and trigger memories of probably people that you know that could be part of this story. So don't hesitate to be in touch. I'll be handing back to Natasha, and I know that she's happy to be that.
May I just say, Penelope, last word, with COVID-19 arrangements in Victoria, the exhibition is restricted visiting wise, so you do have to book. You must book.
You do have to book. I do encourage that, but you can be spontaneous too, because and if you're passing, you can come in. We just have to juggle that we can't have too many people there on site at any one time.
Just not far from the old Freemasons in Clarendon Street in East Melbourne, so you'll know it when you go past the building. It's just between Albert Street and Victoria Parade.
I want to thank you too so much, Madonna and Odette, for making this contribution today to this talk. People's feedback have just been, this is wonderful, exciting, it's insightful, it's all those things. It's highly stimulating, and there's both brilliance and some tragedy in there. So I think it's certainly given me a lot to think about, as I'm sure it has all the audience. And I want to thank, as I hand back to Natasha, I want to thank Prov for this wonderful opportunity and invitation, and to consider this story as part of their International Women's Day event. So thank you so much to you, Prov.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Penelope, and thanks, Odette and Madonna. And thanks to everyone for watching and for your fantastic questions. I know we had a rush of questions at the end and we didn't have time to answer them all. But if anyone would like to email me your questions, feel free. My email address is in the invite that you would have got. So if you've got a question you'd like me to pass on to Odette, Madonna, or Penelope, or you've got a question about Prov, about researching, just send them through to me. You'll also receive a recording that you can share with people as well. So I'll email everybody a recording of today's session. Great. And that's all. Just like to say thanks for watching and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be with you all.